In the small, dusty village of Nakuru, where girls were told their place was by the water well, not in a classroom, lived a young girl named Amina. Every morning, she watched her brothers walk to school with shiny books, while she carried a heavy pot to the river. Her heart ached every time her mother whispered, "Girls can't study here." But Amina refused to believe that. She kept an old, torn notebook hidden under her mattress, writing in it with a broken pencil whenever she could. One day, her father sold her only pen to buy sugar, and that night, as she stared at the empty space where it once lay, she made herself a promise. One day, she would build a school where every girl could learn. The villagers laughed when they heard her dream. They called her foolish and said she should focus on marriage. But Amina worked quietly, saving every coin, learning from anyone who would teach her. Years passed, and the laughter faded. One morning, the people of Nakuru woke to see walls rising from the dusty ground, Amina's school. The same villagers who once mocked her now lined up outside, asking her to teach their daughters. When the first bell rang, Amina looked at the rows of smiling girls in clean uniforms and felt tears fill her eyes. She had kept her promise. The girl who once had no pen had built a place where dreams could never be sold again. Tariro grew up in a small village where girls were expected to cook, clean, and marry young. No one believed in books or classrooms. The elders often said, "Books can't cook food," and her father would nod in agreement. But Tariro's heart beat differently. She loved school. Every mark on her report card felt like proof that she could change her story. One day, she came home smiling, holding her report card close to her chest. She had scored the highest marks in her class. But instead of praise, her father snatched it from her hands, tore it into pieces, and shouted, "You waste time. Books won't fill your stomach." Tears filled her eyes as she ran behind the house, clutching the torn pieces. She trembled, but deep inside, her dream stayed alive. That night, when everyone slept, Tariro sat under the moonlight with her broken report card spread before her. She whispered to herself, "I'll show them that books can feed us all." Every evening after her chores, she sneaked away to meet traveling teachers who passed through the village. She washed their clothes, fetched water, and in return they taught her to read and write more. Her hands were rough from work, but her mind grew sharper each day. Some nights she studied with only the moon as her lamp, and when the rains came, she covered her books with a cooking pot to keep them dry. Years went by, and Tariro's quiet determination turned into a mission. With the small money she earned selling vegetables and handmade baskets, she started collecting books. She began teaching the younger children under a tree, using the sand as her blackboard. Slowly, people began to notice. The same villagers who once mocked her started sending their children to her tree school. They saw how her students could count change, read letters, and help them in ways they never imagined. Then one bright morning, the sound of hammers and laughter filled the air. A building was rising where the tree once stood. It was Tariro's school. She had saved enough and gathered support to build a real classroom with walls and windows. On the day it opened, the whole village came. The elders who had once said books can't cook food now walked slowly toward her, their hands carrying baskets of grain, beans, and fruit as gifts. They stood in front of her, their voices trembling. "You were right, child," one elder said softly. "You were right." Tariro smiled, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at the rows of children sitting on wooden benches, books open on their laps, their faces glowing with excitement. She thought about that night long ago when she hid behind the house, clutching the torn report card. The girl who once studied under the moonlight had built a place where light would never fade again. And in that moment, Tariro knew she had not just fed minds, she had fed generations. Zainal grew up in a small, quiet village where girls were not allowed to go to school. Every morning, she watched her stepbrothers walk to class with their clean shirts and shiny shoes, while she stayed home to fetch water and cook. But she always felt a deep hunger inside her, not for food, but for learning. When her chores were done, she would sneak out and sit behind the classroom wall, peeking through the cracks in the wooden boards. She couldn't see the teacher clearly, but she could hear every word. She traced letters in the dust with her finger, whispering the lessons to herself. Sometimes, tears rolled down her cheeks as she listened, because she wanted so badly to be part of that world. Her stepbrother often found her there and laughed cruelly. "You'll marry before you even learn your name," he would say, tossing stones near her feet. But Zainal didn't stop. She waited every day until the bell rang, then rushed home before anyone noticed. One afternoon, a kind teacher saw her outside and asked why she was hiding. When Zainal told her the truth, the teacher gave her an old book and said, "Keep this safe. One day it will take you far." That book became her greatest treasure. At night, when everyone slept, Zainal studied by the dim light of a burning stick. She taught herself to read and write, using old newspapers and scraps of paper she found near the market. Her dream grew stronger each day. One day, a visiting education officer noticed her reading while selling vegetables. He was amazed and helped her apply for a scholarship. When the letter came, she cried so hard she could hardly open it. It said she had been chosen to study in the city. Her stepbrother laughed again, saying, "You won't last a week there." But she packed her small bag, took her precious book, and left without looking back. Life in the city was hard. She worked as a cleaner to pay for her meals, studied late into the night, and often went hungry. But her dream kept her going. She finished school with top marks and later earned a degree in education. 10 years after leaving her village, Zainal returned, not as the poor girl who once hid behind the window, but as a woman with a purpose. The same children who once teased her now ran to greet her, calling her Teacher Zainal. She used her savings and donations to build a school on the very land where she had once begged to study. When the school was finally complete, the whole village gathered for the opening. As she cut the ribbon, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at the rows of girls in bright uniforms and said softly, "Now every girl can learn her name and write her story." The crowd fell silent, and even her stepbrother lowered his head. Zainal smiled. The girl who once listened through cracks had opened a door for all. Aisha grew up in a small, sun-baked village where people believed a woman's worth was measured by her beauty, her cooking, and the number of cows her marriage could bring. No one ever spoke of dreams or education for girls. When she was little, Aisha would watch the village boys walking to school with bags over their shoulders and laughter in their voices. She wanted that life too, the books, the learning, the freedom. But whenever she said she wanted to study, people laughed. "Aisha, you'll be a wife, not a teacher," her aunt told her. Still, that dream stayed burning quietly inside her, like a tiny flame that refused to die. Years later, when Aisha began to earn a little money selling handmade baskets and beads, everyone expected her to buy jewelry and fine clothes to attract a husband. But she had a different plan. She started buying bricks, one by one. The villagers laughed louder than ever. "Bricks can't find you a husband," they shouted. Some called her crazy. Others said she was wasting her youth. Aisha didn't argue, she just smiled and kept working. Every evening she stacked her bricks neatly in a corner of her yard, whispering to herself, "These will build something bigger than gold." After months of saving, she finally gathered enough to start. The first wall went up slowly under the hot sun, built by her own hands and a few friends who believed in her. The men watched from a distance, shaking their heads. But as the walls rose higher and higher, something changed. The laughter stopped. People started asking questions. "What is she building? Is it really a school? Can girls study here?" Aisha kept working, her heart full of determination. When the roof was finally set, she stood back and looked at the small but strong building. It wasn't fancy, but to her, it was beautiful, her dream made of bricks and hope. On the first day of school, Aisha woke before sunrise. She swept the floor, set out a few benches, and waited nervously. She thought maybe 5 or 6 children might come. But as the sun rose, she saw them, girls walking barefoot from every corner of the village. Some wore torn dresses, some carried younger siblings on their backs, and many clutched small sticks to use as pencils. By the time the bell rang, 50 girls were sitting inside, their faces glowing with excitement. Aisha stood in front of them, her heart trembling. She looked at their bright eyes and dusty feet and felt tears run down her cheeks. In that moment, she understood something powerful. This school was no longer just her dream. It belonged to every girl who had ever been told, "You can't." Outside, the same people who once mocked her now watched in silence. And when the girls began to read their first words aloud, Aisha smiled through her tears, knowing she had built more than a school, she had built a future. Myram grew up in a tiny village surrounded by wide fields and mango trees. There was no school nearby, and most parents didn't think children needed one. "Books don't fill stomachs," they would say. But Myram believed learning could change everything. She had finished only a few years of school herself before walking miles each day became too hard. Still, she couldn't forget the feeling of holding a book, the joy of reading her first story, or the dream of helping other children feel that same magic. So one morning, she decided to do something that made the whole village laugh. She started a school under a mango tree. She carried an old broken door from her home and leaned it against the tree to use as a blackboard. Her chalk was just small white stones she found by the road. She gathered a few neighborhood children, some barefoot, some holding little siblings, and began to teach them the alphabet. "A, B, C," she called out proudly. The children laughed and clapped, their voices filling the air. But not everyone was happy. Some villagers pointed at her and whispered, "Look at her nonsense school, teaching under a tree. Who will take her seriously?" Even her friends told her to stop wasting her time. But Mayim refused to listen. Every morning she returned to her mango tree, writing lessons with her broken stones, smiling as more and more children came to learn. When the rains came, they huddled under the tree, protecting their few books with banana leaves. When the sun burned too hot, they took turns fanning one another with old paper. Some days they didn't have pencils or paper, so Mayim used sticks to draw in the dirt. But even then, the children came. They came because her classroom wasn't just about reading and writing, it was about hope. Over the years, her nonsense school began to grow. Parents noticed that the children who studied under Mayim's mango tree could read signs, count money, and even help with farming in smarter ways. Slowly, respect replaced laughter. The same villagers who once mocked her began to send their own children. One day, a journalist passing through the area wrote a story about her little school under the tree. That story spread across the country. Donations began to arrive, books, desks, even cement for a real classroom. 10 years later, the sound of a helicopter filled the sky above the same village. The president had come to officially open the new Tree of Knowledge Academy, built where the old mango tree still stood tall. Cameras flashed as Mayim, dressed in a simple dress and holding a bouquet of flowers, stood beside the president. In the crowd, she saw the same people who had once laughed at her now bowing their heads in respect. As she smiled through her tears, she looked up at the mango tree, its green leaves swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if the tree itself was smiling back, proud that it had witnessed every step of her journey. Libo had always loved numbers. To her, math was like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and every correct answer felt like a small victory. But not everyone saw it that way. In her dusty village, most people believed girls weren't meant for school, especially not for math. One afternoon, when her teacher announced the results of a test, he looked at her with a smirk and said, "Girls can't pass math, Libo. You should focus on learning to cook instead." The whole class laughed. Her cheeks burned, but she didn't say a word. She went home quietly, opened her worn-out notebook, and whispered to herself, "I'll prove him wrong." From that day, she studied harder than ever. Every evening, she sat outside her small house under the stars, solving problems with a piece of charcoal on scraps of paper. When she didn't understand something, she asked questions fearlessly. Her mother often scolded her for staying up too late, but Libo would smile and say, "Just one more sum." And slowly her hard work began to show. She started topping every exam. The same teacher who once doubted her now used her answers to explain lessons to the boys. But just when her dreams were starting to bloom, everything changed. One morning, news spread that all schools in her region were being shut down because of conflict and lack of funding. Teachers left, classrooms locked up, and children were sent home. Libo felt her world collapse. For days, she sat outside the empty school gate, staring at the locked door. But one afternoon, as she watched a group of younger girls playing nearby, something clicked inside her. She stood up and said, "If school won't come to us, we'll make our own." The next morning, she gathered those girls and led them to an old bridge by the river, a place where no one would bother them. With broken benches and a few notebooks she had saved, she began to teach them everything she knew. They studied math, reading, and even science, using sticks to draw on the dusty ground. The sound of laughter and learning soon filled the air under that bridge. Word spread fast. More children began to join, walking miles every morning to learn from the girl under the bridge. Soon, her small class turned into a real school. Parents started helping, bringing old books and food for the children. Even teachers from nearby towns came to see what Libo had built. One day, a journalist passing through heard about it and wrote a story calling her the girl who taught the world from under a bridge. Within weeks, people across the country were talking about her. Donations poured in and the government eventually reopened official schools. But none had more students or more spirit than Libo's bridge school. When reporters asked her how she felt, she just smiled shyly and said, "I'm not special. I just got lucky." But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't luck. It was courage, determination, and a belief that no wall or closed door could stop a girl who was ready to learn, even if her classroom was under a bridge. Nia grew up in a small village where life was simple but hard. Every morning, her mother sent her to the fields to help with farming, reminding her, "Books won't feed you, my child. Food comes from the soil, not from paper." Nia never argued, but deep inside, she believed knowledge could change more than soil ever could. When she wasn't working, she would sit by the riverbank with a borrowed book, tracing each word carefully, dreaming of a life where she could learn freely. Her neighbors laughed and called her foolish, saying, "Why study when you'll just end up in the kitchen?" But Nia never stopped reading. She worked in other people's gardens just to earn a few coins for notebooks. Years passed, and her love for learning only grew stronger. She managed to attend evening classes in the nearby town, walking miles each day. Her mother never truly understood, but she tolerated it, thinking the phase would fade. Then one dark season, her mother fell seriously ill. The family's savings were gone, and the medicine was too expensive. Everyone said there was nothing to be done. But Nia, now a young woman with an education, found a job at a small office in the city. With her first paycheck, she bought her mother's medicine. Slowly, her mother's health began to improve. Watching her daughter rush home every weekend, still wearing her office uniform, carrying both food and medicine, something in her heart began to change. When her mother was strong enough to walk again, Nia used the little inheritance her late father had left to build something special, a small classroom made of mud bricks and iron sheets, just behind their hut. The villagers laughed again. "Another dreamer," they said, "who will send their children to a hut school?" But Nia didn't listen. She painted the walls herself, borrowed benches from the church, and gathered old books from kind neighbors. When everything was ready, she placed a small chalkboard at the front and wrote one word on it: "Welcome." On the morning the school opened, the air was filled with excitement. Children from the village arrived shyly, clutching notebooks and broken pencils. Some had never seen the inside of a classroom before. Nia's mother, though still weak, insisted on coming to see. Wrapped in her old shawl, she leaned on a stick and watched her daughter teaching under the bright morning sun. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I was wrong, my daughter, books feed the soul." Her voice broke, and those standing nearby began to cry, not from pity, but from pride. From that day, the little classroom behind the hut became a symbol of hope. Children laughed and learned where once there had been only silence. And each time Nia picked up her chalk to write on the board, she remembered her mother's words, proof that sometimes knowledge not only feeds the mind but heals the heart too. Adana was never like the other girls in her village. While others quietly followed the rules, she asked questions that made the elders frown. She wanted to know why girls weren't allowed in school, why boys could dream while girls could only serve. One day, when she boldly told the village chief she wanted to be a teacher, he laughed and said, "You are too bold for a girl. Girls who talk too much forget their place." His words burned in her heart, but instead of breaking her, they made her stronger. She promised herself that one day, every girl in her village would have a place to learn. Adana worked harder than anyone imagined. She studied under the faint light of a candle, borrowed books from neighbors, and tutored younger children to earn money for her own schooling. When she finally graduated, she didn't stop there, she dreamed bigger. Using every coin she saved, she started her first school in a small rented building. The children came in barefoot, carrying sticks as pencils, but their laughter filled the room like sunlight. That was the beginning of something greater. Years later, her dream had grown into a chain of schools called the Dawn Academy. On the opening day of the main campus, she invited the whole village, including the same chief who once mocked her. When he arrived and saw hundreds of girls in bright uniforms reciting science formulas and poems, his hands began to shake. He dropped his staff, his eyes wet with tears, and said softly, "You have changed the sun, Adana, it shines differently now." Adana smiled humbly, her heart full. The girl who was once called too bold had lit a dawn for every girl who dared to dream.